Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. To reiterate, my name is Brian Walter, and I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Blue Water War, the Maritime Struggle in the Mediterranean and Middle East, 1940 to 1945. This was a colossal struggle that was waged over a period of 5 years, primarily between the maritime power of Great Britain and later the United States against the combined power of Italy, Germany, and at times the Vichy French. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, I'd like to be able to talk about the entire campaign, but I'd be unable to do so because we'd be still talking here tomorrow. So today I'm only going to be talking about a sliver of that campaign, essentially a 2.5-month period that occurs between middle of August 1944 through the end of October 1944. And the general situation that existed at this time was this. 15 months prior, the Allies had completed their conquest of Africa. In the process of doing so, they had destroyed all Axis forces there. Thereafter, the Allies had landed in Sicily and conquered that island. In process of doing so, this had prompted the Italian fascist leadership to depose Mussolini and form a new government. This new government will immediately begin secret negotiations with the Western Allies to leave the war. Armistice will be concluded at the beginning of September 1943. Which again will involve the Italians actually leaving the Axis. And one of the stipulations that's in that armistice agreement that brings this about is that the Italians will surrender their fleet to the Allies. Now, I know in past discussions we've had, different disagreements as to whether or not the Italian fleet surrendered or whether they simply switched sides. But in either case, the Italian fleet is eliminated from the Axis order of battle. Thereafter, the Germans simply roll in and take charge of Italy, and it becomes another occupied country, just like many other countries in Europe. The Western Allies land, and for the next 20 months, the Allies and the Germans will wage a battle to gain control over Italy, while the Italians, by and large, are bystanders to the events that are going on in their country. So the situation as it exists going into this period of August 1944 is the Western Allies control the lower 2/3 of Italy, as well as Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, whereas the Germans control the northern third of Italy, southern France, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece. Next slide, please. At this late date in the war, someone might realistically and reasonably surmise that maybe there wasn't much of a naval contest that was still underway at this time. After all, the Italian fleet had surrendered the year before. But in fact, there was still surprisingly a fairly robust naval contest that was underway. Simply put, the German Kriegsmarine, the Navy, had moved in and essentially assumed the mantle of Axis leadership in regards to the naval conflict once the Italians had capitulated. They were able to do this using 3 different systems. First and foremost, they had their U-boats, and they also had the Luftwaffe, which had been present in the Mediterranean since 1941. And in fact, early in the conflict, the Luftwaffe had been the Royal Navy's greatest antagonist, being much more of a threat to the Royal Navy than the Italian Navy had been. The Luftwaffe and the U-boats will continue their operations in the Mediterranean after Italy's capitulation. However, in fairness, by the time you roll into the August 1944 timeframe, both of those forces have been largely attrited to the extent that they're really only a shadow of their former selves. The other means that the Germans use in order to really carry on this contest is using captured Italian and Allied warships. All right. Now, as I said before, the Italian fleet surrenders, and eventually a total of 108 vessels will come under Allied control as a result of this. But large numbers of Italian ships aren't able to get away. By and large, these are smaller vessels, destroyers and torpedo boats. By and large, these are non-operational at the time. Many being under repair due to battle damage, or in many cases, these are new ships under construction. And then to add to that, since they're unable to get away, many of these ships will be further damaged by the Italians who either sabotage or scuttle them. Nevertheless, the Germans very efficiently roll in, will raise many of these vessels and put them into service in the German Kriegsmarine. So again, they will be able to continue on this combat using primarily these captured Italian warships, along with a handful of captured Yugoslav and French warships. Next slide, please. All right, when we're talking about these different warships that were utilized, there are 3 different categories that I primarily want to mention here. The first of these were the torpedo boats. The Germans identified their torpedo boats with a TA designator. And these torpedo boats should not be confused with motor torpedo boats or PT boats. These were essentially small destroyers. And I have 3 examples shown here. You have TA-15, TA-18, and TA-37. Now, another classification of warships that the Germans used were what they call fast escorts. And they identified these with an SG designator. And these were, again, primarily converted merchant ships that had been converted to military applications. But this also included a handful of purpose-built warships, primarily coming from French sources. And again, I have an example of one of these here, SG-21, which is shown there. And then finally, a third category warship that they used were what they call sub-chasers. And this was designated by a UJ designation. And again, many of these were converted trawlers and other type of civilian craft that had been adopted for military use. But this also included a number of, and I'm sure I might maybe not pronounce it right, Gabbiano class Italian corvettes that they were able to seize and put into active service within the German Navy. And again, I have an example of one of those, which was UJ 6081. Next slide, please. So what of the Allied naval forces during this time frame? In the summer of 1944, the Allied naval forces were fulfilling 4 major missions. The first and foremost of these was the maintenance of maritime lines of communication. This not only included ships that were sailing within the theater and terminating within the theater to support combat operations in Southern Europe, but this also included large numbers of vessels that were transferring through the Mediterranean en route to and from the Indian Ocean. And the scale of this enterprise is demonstrated by the fact that from July through September 1944, the total number of merchant ships that traveled in the Mediterranean convoy and routing system amounted to 14,898. So large numbers of vessels are transporting through the Mediterranean. And the #1 priority of the Allies is to maintain that logistical flow. Now, a second important mission is to provide material and operational support to the American Fifth Army, which is operating on the western side of Italy. A third mission is to provide similar support to the British Eighth Army, which is operating on the Adriatic side of Italy. And then finally, the fourth mission is to interdict German maritime operations, which are underway in the waters off northern Italy, as well as in the Adriatic and the Aegean. Next slide, please. In the middle of August 1944, the Allies will add a fifth mission to this, and that is to conduct Operation Dragoon. There you go. I had a slip there for a minute. Operation Dragoon, which is the invasion of southern France. All right. This undertaking will initially land 3 American divisions on a stretch of coastline about 45 miles long, located between Toulon and Nice. And then thereafter, there are 7 additional French divisions that are immediately earmarked for follow-up, and additional forces will again come in from the United States as necessary and as the situation develops. Next slide, please. For the naval forces associated with this, the Allies will eventually garner a fairly large naval force that will ultimately include some 1,034 vessels. The combat portion of this will include 5 battleships, 9 escort carriers, 25 cruisers, and 86 destroyers. This will come under the command of American Vice Admiral Henry Hewitt, and the national breakdown of these vessels will be 59.4% coming from the United States, 35.6% coming from the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth, and then the remaining 5% coming from other navies, primarily the French Navy. And this breakdown of forces, I think, is very important because it emphasizes one thing here. This is the first and only time in a major amphibious assault that will occur in the European theater of war where the United States plays the dominant role. In all other major maritime landings, be that in North Africa, Sicily, certainly the Normandy invasion, the British are the dominant players, at least when it comes to the maritime forces involved. But here, the United States is playing the dominant role. The next slide, please. Okay, so the initial landings will occur, and the Americans will break down their forces into 4 attack groups. Those attack groups being Alpha, Delta, Camel, and Sitka. The first 3 of the attack groups will land the American 3rd, 45th, and 36th divisions, respectively, from west to east. Well, the 4th attack group, Sitka, will conduct support operations on the flanks of the invasion. Each of these attack groups will have an assigned bombardment element to provide fire support, and a total of 60 ships will be involved in these fire support activities. And in addition to that, each attack group will be preceded by minesweepers and dan layers that'll sweep and provide safe channels to the assault areas. Next slide, please. In addition to the naval armada that is assembled for this, the Allies will also earmark a total of about 4,000 aircraft to support the undertaking and the subsequent liberation of southern France. Most of these aircraft will come from the Allied Mediterranean Air Force, but this will also include a naval contingent in the form of Task Force 88, which is under the command of British Rear Admiral T.H. Troubridge. This task force consists of 7 British and 2 American escort carriers with a total of 224 aircraft. These are Seafire, Hellcat, and Wildcat fighter bombers. And Task Force 88 will be assigned 3 missions during the course of Operation Dragoon. The first is to provide, obviously, air security for the fleet itself. The second is to provide spotter support to the bombarding warships, and a number of the pilots on both the British and the American carriers have been trained to perform this specialized duty. And then finally, the third mission, as conditions allow, are to conduct offensive fighter bomber sweeps against the Germans. Next slide, please. Now, what of the German defenses that are arrayed to, try and repel this invasion? Unfortunately, from a German point of view, they're in a very precarious state. The primary command that's responsible for the defense of southern France is the German 19th Army. At the time, the 19th Army has 7 understrength infantry divisions that are spread out along the coastline of southern France, and they have 2 further divisions, a armored division and a mountain division that are held in reserve. Of these forces, only 2 of the divisions are in the area that the Americans will assault. Beyond this, the Luftwaffe's strength has been whittled down to almost nothing, to the extent that they only have 65 operational aircraft, serviceable aircraft that are readily available to contest the invasion. And the situation for the Navy isn't in much better shape. At this time, the Germans only have 6 U-boats left in the Mediterranean, but of those, only 3 are located in the Western Mediterranean, and only 1 of those is operational at the time of the invasion. As far as surface vessels are concerned, the Germans have 2 flotillas of surface craft within the region. However, most of these are auxiliaries and merchant conversion types of limited combat value. Most of the warships that I was talking about earlier are actually located in the waters around Italy, the Adriatic, and the Aegean. And so only a handful of those vessels are actually in the area to be able to meet the Allied invasion. So given the forces involved, the Germans really have limited ability here to respond to this. Next slide, please. And that'll be borne out when the invasion actually occurs, which happens on the 15th of October, 15th of August, 1944. Commando and airborne units will start landing shortly after midnight, and the main assaults will go in then at dawn. And the defense against this will be sporadic to light. The sole example of this, exception to this, will be at Camel Red Beach, where persistent German artillery fire forces the Allies to cancel the proposed landings there and move the assault forces to an adjacent beach. But this is a minor setback, and by day's end, the American forces are firmly ashore, with most of their units having advanced past their D-Day objectives. And thereafter, the Americans are able to accelerate the buildup of forces from that point on. As it turns out then, as a result, by the end of the day on the 17th, the Americans will have 86,575 men, 12,250 vehicles, and 46,140 tons of supplies ashore. And of course, that buildup will continue. Next slide, please. As to be expected, the German response to this in terms of their Luftwaffe naval forces are fairly feeble. In the case of the Luftwaffe, it's so feeble that the Air Ministry, the British Air Ministry, will later call it too insignificant for comment. In fact, the German Luftwaffe will be able to sink a single LST with a glider bomb, but that will be about the extent of their success. As far as the Navy is concerned, they really have no positive results to show for their actions, other than the fact that they suffer heavy losses in return. On the morning of the invasion, the American destroyer Summers will encounter 2 German warships, those being the fast escort SG-21 and the corvette UJ-6081. off of Port Cross, and in a spirited engagement, it'll sink both of those vessels. During the same day, a group of British minesweepers will encounter 5 German patrol vessels, and they will sink all 5. And then 2 days later, the American destroyer Endicott will team up with 2 British gunboats to engage and sink 2 German warships. You have the corvette UJ-6082, and you have an auxiliary subchaser. The results of these surface engagements, fairly minor surface engagements, and yet these actions by these American destroyers represent the only time in the Second World War where American principal warships engaged German principal warships in surface actions. Of course, the United States, and not Vince is shaking his head here. The United States will engage in multiple times again in the Pacific, but this is the only time they engage the German surface warships with principal American warships. And I guess Vince might ask me about that later on. All right. I'm aware of the French in North Africa, Vince. All right. Going on. As far as the sole German U-boat that's operational at the time, that is U-230. That'll sortie out of Toulon on the 17th and will accomplish nothing for its efforts and scuttle itself 4 days later when it accidentally grounds in shallow water. Of the remaining access surface ships that are and warships that are in the region, these are mostly non-operational at the time of the invasion, and they will all be sunk either by American bombing or as a result of German scuttling, which will include 2 more U-boats, 2 torpedo boats, and 4 fast escorts that are lost. Next slide, please. Okay, so while this is underway, obviously the Allied forces are breaking out of the lodgement area and beginning their liberation of southern France. In this, they are greatly aided by a German decision on the 16th to withdraw their forces from the region. The exception to that will be around Toulon and Marseille, where the Germans will leave behind 31,000 troops to garrison those ports. But the idea is they want to prevent those ports from falling into Allied hands, or at least delay that eventuality as long as they possibly can. Now, as it turns out, most of the troops that are left behind are naval, Luftwaffe, and administrative personnel of dubious combat value. And as soon as these forces come under heavy attack by French ground forces, who in turn are supported by the heavy guns of the Allied warships, the defenses quickly crumble. And by the 28th of August, both Toulon and Marseille are in Allied hands, along with 28,000 German prisoners. And I think that shows that leaving these men behind proved to be a futile effort on the Germans' part and a waste of the manpower involved. Meanwhile, the rest of the German army retreats northward. They're pursued by American forces and harried by French partisans, as well as Allied air attacks that take a heavy toll upon them. In terms of those air attacks, this includes the activities of Task Force 88, which during the course of Operation Dragoon will fly a total of 2,300 sorties, many of which are offensive fighter sweeps. And during the course of those fighter sweeps, they'll claim the destruction or damage to over 750 motor vehicles, 21 locomotives, about 20 barges and coastal vessels, and 19 German aircraft. The task force will lose 43 aircraft in return during combat operations. Next slide, please. By the 15th of September 1944, the advancing Allied armies move into central France, and by this time, General Eisenhower will take command of those forces. And thereafter, all combat operations that occur in France will fall under the guise of the Northwest Europe campaign. The role left to the Mediterranean forces is to provide logistical support to this. And to this end, on the 40 days following the invasion, the Allies will sweep a total of 550 mines and open up 6 French ports along southern France, including Toulon and Marseille, for their seat of Allied supplies. And this will begin then a torrent of materials that will flow through the region, which in October will amount to 524,894 tons that are delivered. And then thereafter that, this amount of tonnage will decline slightly, but for the remainder of the war, it'll average 493,772 tons per month. So again, a great deal of supplies are flowing through here, and most of these are utilized to support the American 6th Army Group, which will be operating on the southern flank of General Eisenhower's command. Next slide, please. So the accomplishment of this logistical mission really is the primary purpose behind Dragoon, but there are other benefits also that will take place as a result of this operation. Amongst these is it really just destroys the last vestiges of German maritime and air power in the Western Mediterranean. Now, prior to this, the year before, the Allies had opened up the Mediterranean to their own convoy traffic. However, those convoys had been subjected to periodic, German U-boat and air attacks, primarily in the Western Mediterranean. And now with these events of Operation Dragoon, that threat is entirely eliminated. A second major contribution that this has is it really helps compromise, along with the activities, of course, that are going on at Normandy, it really helps compromise the entire German defensive position in all of France. And it compels the Germans to do a precipitous withdrawal from the country. Now, the exception to this is the French Atlantic ports, which, again, similar to Toulon and Marseille, the Germans end up leaving behind a total of over 110,000 men to garrison the important ports that are located there in the Bay of Biscay. Unfortunately for the Germans, if you want to look at it that way, is this kind of proves to be a futile effort, because a month later, British and Canadian forces will capture more useful ports in northern France and Belgium. And once these are opened, it will really render the French Atlantic ports unnecessary to the Allied cause. So the fact that the Germans leave these 110,000 men behind, in my mind, is kind of a waste of manpower assets, because they really play no useful impediment to the Allied war effort. Some of these men will eventually be taken prisoner when the Americans capture the port of Brest, but the rest of the garrisons, the Allies will just leave and let wither on the vine, and these men will play no useful role in the German war effort thereafter. However, since the Germans do control these ports, they can't use them for their own benefit. Prior to this, the French Atlantic ports had been the major ports by which the Germans have operated their U-boats against the Atlantic. And they have to abandon operations from there and move those operations to Norway. Unfortunately for the Germans, Norway can only handle about a third of the U-boats that the French Atlantic ports have been able to do so, and it's farther away from the U-boat patrol areas. So the result of this is this abandonment of the French Atlantic ports is going to compel the Germans, it's going to impede German U-boat operations for the remainder of the war. And to add insult to injury, the Germans are going to suffer very heavy losses in the process of this abandonment, which in August and early September are going to include the loss of 3 destroyers, 2 torpedo boats, 22 U-boats, and 23 fleet minesweepers, and about 350,000 tons of shipping. So very heavy losses. Now, again, this is obviously occurring outside of the Mediterranean, but the activities in the invasion of southern France have helped facilitate this event. And so that's why I included it as one of the benefits that Dragoon provides. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to kind of wrap this up about Operation Dragoon, and we'll finally talk about what the costs were associated with the different sides. Now, again, the Germans here really don't attempt to defend southern France and generally disengage. Nevertheless, they still suffer heavy losses, both in terms of manpower and material. In terms of manpower, the Germans will end up giving up 78,928 prisoners, including the 28,000 that are captured along with the French Atlantic ports, or the southern ports that I mentioned. In addition to this, the Germans will lose, in terms of maritime assets, a total of 12 principal warships and 97 merchant ships worth 279,305 tons that are either captured or scuttled, by the Germans when they withdraw. For the Allies, losses aren't nearly as heavy. This includes 12,911 ground casualties, which I guess is a substantial number, but certainly far less than what the Germans suffered. And the naval losses are practically nil. The Allies lose no principal warships. They do lose 1 LST, and they lose about 12 minor vessels in addition to that. So a very minor cost in terms of the maritime operation. Next slide, please. So this concludes our discussion about Operation Dragoon, but we're not quite done yet, because even as Dragoon was winding down, events were occurring on the other side of the Mediterranean that promised to offer the Allies opportunities for both political and military exploitation. In particular, given the deteriorating situation that was occurring for the Germans on the Eastern Front, plus the fact that Romania and Bulgaria had both opted to leave the war, the Germans realized that their forces in Greece were threatened with being cut off by the advancing Soviet armies. And as a result of this, Hitler uncharacteristically agrees to withdrawal of those forces from Greece. The Allies, of course, learn of this through Ultra and other intelligence sources, and they're determined to go ahead and harry this withdrawal and quickly follow it up in order to accomplish two things. First, in strictly a military sense, they want to cause as much attrition to the Germans as they're withdrawing, but more importantly to that, they want to ensure the orderly return of a friendly Greek government once the Germans depart. And this second mission is driven by the knowledge that communist partisans are poised to take over the country once the Germans withdraw. So the Allies want to prevent that and ensure a friendly Western government will in fact come to power once the Germans withdraw. Next slide, please. So now that the two sides had their various missions, they go about the process of gathering the forces in order to carry this out. For the Germans, this includes a total of 52 merchant ships that they'll assemble, worth a total of 27,230 tons to conduct transport operations. They also will use large numbers of naval craft. Most of these are auxiliaries, but this will include some purpose-built vessels, including 3 torpedo boats that are moved into the area from the Adriatic. They also have access to about 200 kayaks, which are Greek fishing vessels. And then finally, they assemble about 80 transport aircraft for aerial evacuation. As far as the Allies, the timing of this doesn't necessarily come at the best time for them, since not only is Operation Dragoon winding down, but they've just launched a major offensive in Italy called Operation Olive to breach the German Gothic line. And this involves both Allied armies in Italy with a total of about 20 divisions. The point of this is there aren't a lot of available forces readily available for operations in Greece. Nevertheless, the British are able to put an improvised force together. And I say the British because unlike Operation Dragoon, where that was predominantly an American-run operation, this is overwhelmingly a British operation here. And they're able to put together this scratch force. The naval element of this is primarily Force 120, which is under, again, Rear Admiral Troubridge's command. It consists of 7 escort carriers that have available 140 aircraft, 7 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 11 escort destroyers. In addition to this, the British will also utilize various other vessels, including submarines and some coastal craft. They have access to the aircraft of the Allied Mediterranean Air Force, as well as RAF Command Middle East. And then finally, they will assemble 2 Army brigades, along with Royal Marine Commando and Free Greek Army units to participate in this undertaking. Next slide, please. The naval portion of the interdiction operations will begin in the second week of September with Operation Outing. This consists of a series of offensive sweeps that are carried out by British warships, as well as carrier airstrikes targeting German infrastructure targets in the southern Aegean. Some of the highlights of Operation Outing include on the 12th and 13th of September, that night, the British destroyers Troubridge and Tuscan will attack a small German convoy off north of Crete, and they'll sink the transport Tony and 5 other vessels. 2 nights later, the cruiser Royalist and the destroyer Teaser will encounter and sink 2 German war transports, KT-4 and KT-26. Then on the 16th and the 17th, the British will launch a series of carrier strikes against Crete and Melos, which will destroy or damage about 30 motor vehicles and about a dozen kayaks and other local craft. During that same time frame, the cruiser Aurora bombards Melos Harbor, and it destroys a beach merchant ship and 3 other vessels. While concurrently, a number of British and a Polish destroyer will encounter one of the last remaining U-boats that remain in the Mediterranean, this being U-407, and they will destroy that. And then finally, on the 19th, British carrier aircraft will attack Rhodes Harbor, where they will destroy a merchant ship and 3 other vessels and damage 3 depot ships and a transport. Next slide, please. Okay, so over the next 2.5 weeks, the British will continue their interdiction operations, and they'll destroy at least another 18 German vessels. Then by the time you roll in the second week of October, British warships are actually operating off the Greek mainland. Some of, again, the highlights of those operations will include on the night of 6 to 7 October, the destroyers Termagant and Tuscan will intercept a convoy in the Gulf of Salonika and sink the torpedo boat TA-37 and 2 minor escorts for no loss to themselves. 12 days later, those same 2 British destroyers will have a similar success when they engage and sink the German torpedo boat TA-18 in roughly the same area. Meanwhile, British carrier aircraft are going to carry out a series of attacks against both maritime targets and ground targets within the region, during which time they're going to sink or seriously damage about 30 different vessels, as well as 12 locomotives and about 100 railway trucks and vehicles. Also during this time frame, British Seafire carrier aircraft are going to hit and severely damage the German torpedo boat TA-38, which is forced to take shelter in Volos Harbor. Next slide, please. While these naval operations are underway, the Allies will also use their shore-based aircraft to also carry out interdiction operations against the Germans. This will come in 3 forms. First, the Allies will use direct attacks at sea to target transiting German warships. This will overwhelmingly be an RAF endeavor using RAF Bullfighter strike aircraft. And during September alone, these RAF Bullfighters will sink 2 German mine layers and at least 6 other vessels. A second aspect of this is targeting the German transport aircraft. And they'll do this in 2 ways. Number one, they'll bomb the local German airfields, but also as the campaign develops, the British will move in the fighter direction ship Ulster Queen into the area. And over several nights, Ulster Queen will direct British night fighters to intercept the transiting German transport aircraft as they're flying in and out of Crete and some of the other areas. And through these operations, the British will claim, British and American forces involved will claim about 45 transport aircrafts destroyed with another 20 damaged. And then finally, and probably most prolifically, there'll be a number of bomber raids against the local ports. And some of the highlights of that include on the 15th of September, the Americans will bomb Salamis, and where they will sink the torpedo boat TA-14, a military transport, and 3 other vessels. 9 days later, the Americans will attack Saramanga and sink 2 U-boats and 4 other vessels. And these U-boats that are sunk here represent the last 2 U-boats in the Mediterranean. So the U-boat threat that has existed now for 4 years is gone. The Germans still have, a number of captured Italian submarines, but they will never use any of these operationally. So the U-boat threat now is eliminated as effectively at this time. On the 12th of October, the British bombers will attack Piraea and sink the torpedo boats TA-15 and TA-17. Both of these vessels are in a non-operational state at the time of this attack, previously having been damaged by British aircraft, and they're simply finished off during this raid. And then the next day, British and South African aircraft attack Volos, where they sink the aforementioned TA-38, which had taken shelter there, as well as 2 large merchant ships and about 25 other vessels. Next slide, please. While these interdiction operations are underway, the British will begin carrying out a variety of local landings in some of the different Aegean islands. In some cases, or in most cases, they'll encounter, small garrisons of either German or fascist Italian forces. And these garrisons, by and large, will surrender after offering little or no resistance to the British. They will also team up with local partisan groups to, among other things, clear the northern Peloponnese and also to capture the Albanian port of Saranda. In the process of these operations, obviously, the British are able to at least establish some degree of presence in southern Greece, and they take about 4,000 prisoners during these different operations. By the middle of October, the British are ready to move into the Greek mainland in general, and airborne forces on the 13th will land in airfield outside of Athens. 2 days later, those airborne forces will begin entering Athens, where they'll find indeed the Germans have withdrawn. On the same day, the British will land the 23rd Armored Brigade at Piraeus, along with 3 Greek units. This operation, under the designation of Operation Manna, will be directly supported by 2 British escort carriers, a cruiser, and 6 destroyers. There will be no German opposition, although British carrier aircraft will shoot down 2 German aircraft that stray into the area. Thereafter, the British are eventually able to land 5,000 men, 400 vehicles, and about 1,000 tons of material. On the 18th, the Greek government in exile returns to Athens and assumes control over the country. And then for the remainder of the month, the British will continue to harry the Germans as they are withdrawing from northern Greece. In the meantime, the Germans will suffer their last maritime casualties during the campaign. This will include the loss of a torpedo boat TA-39, which is sunk on a mine strike. It'll also include a large hospital ship, which was seized by the British destroyer Kimberley, and a number of other German vessels, including the mine layer Zeus, which are scuttled as the Germans abandoned the northern Greek ports. Next slide, please. So when looking at the results of this Greek operation, again, the British have reason to be pleased with what they've accomplished. First and foremost is the establishment of a friendly Greek government in the nation. And of course, the communist insurgents will quickly rise up against this. And with British and later American help, this government will survive. And this will provide the Allies with an important post-war victory of sorts, in the fact that Greece will remain in the Allied camp as opposed to the Soviet camp thereafter. Beyond this, of course, the campaign also, costs some fairly high attrition to the Germans, at least in regards to the maritime forces that are involved. This includes the loss of 7 torpedo boats, 3 U-boats, and 3 mine layers. And of the 52 merchant ships that the Germans assembled, a total of 29 worth 19,434 tons will be sunk, and the remainder will mostly be scuttled. And there will be other vessels in addition to this that are also scuttled, bringing the total number of German ships that are scuttled as far as merchant ships to 40, worth 54,077 tons during the month of October. Most of that scuttling occurs in the Greek waters. So fairly heavy losses, at least in terms of the maritime forces involved. Finally, notwithstanding the 4,000 prisoners that the British take earlier in some of those landings that I talked about, the Germans are going to be able to evacuate about 70,000 men from the Aegean Islands, but they leave behind 26,495 German and about 12,000 fascist Italians that are positioned on Crete, Rhodes, and some of the other Aegean Islands. And these forces are cut off, they are isolated, and they really serve no useful purpose. And again, the Allies would just let them wither on the vine. So for all intents and purposes, they may have well have been prisoners of war because they serve no real useful purpose to the German war effort. In turn, against these losses, British losses are minimal. I mean, they lose no principal warships at all. Again, very minimal losses in order to attain these objectives. So next slide, please. Okay, so in summary, summarizing these 2 operations that we've talked about today, there's 4 points I'd like to make. First and foremost, or I should say foremost, but first, both of these operations were successful in attaining the objectives that the Allied leadership had set out for them. Secondly, in both operations, the Allies have been able to inflict heavy losses upon the Germans for not as heavy losses to themselves or minimal losses to themselves. Third, obviously maritime power and units played a major element in both of these operations, a fundamental element. And finally, I think it's fair to say that both of these operations have been largely overlooked by history. And that's particularly true of the Greek operation, which is almost entirely ignored by history. So hopefully today now, we've done a little bit to help remedy that oversight. If you're interested for more information on this, again, you feel free to check out my upcoming book, Blue Water War, which will be out in the United Kingdom in a couple of months, in the United States in the summer. And in the meantime, between now and then, there's also my current book, which is available, which is The Longest Campaign, which deals with the Atlantic struggle. With that, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take your questions.